Hello, and welcome to another edition of Coffee Talk with immigration attorney Brian D. Lerner. I thought in this particular episode I would talk a little bit about asylum and the ways that you can appeal and essentially go up if things don't go your way. So, the other week I had somebody come in my office and they said, they told me what the situation was, and they had an asylum claim. It was religious persecution and possible social group and possible political persecution. So three different grounds that they might have been able to apply for asylum. But the issue was is they didn't have a real strong case. There was zero past persecution. There was a reasonable possibility of future persecution, but like I said, they'd never been persecuted before, and they didn't know anybody specifically that was actually persecuted in their situation. Although there's been documented cases, persons they don't know. So there was a decent possibility. However, a lot of people, when they come into the U.S. and apply for asylum, they think a couple things. One, they think if they apply for asylum, they have asylum. And they think that all they have to do is, tell their story and they'll win. And that's not the case. Okay. Many times, in fact, more times than not, asylum is denied. And it's necessary, if you really qualify, it's necessary to fight for it in order to win. And sometimes you need to fight a few battles in order to win the war. So what brought about this video is these particular clients were saying, well, if we lose, then what's going to happen? Can we appeal? And then if we lose that, can we appeal? And so I discussed with them the path that we could go on, because they were interested in two things. Of course, they were interested in winning the asylum, but if not, then they wanted to know essentially how long they could stay here so they didn't have to go back to their home country and suffer possible persecution, and then perhaps apply for another form of relief while the appeals are going forward, which that's all doable. So let me just tell you essentially the path that you can go on if you come in and apply for asylum and what is essentially involved. So first, you come into the U.S. somehow, and within a year, you apply for asylum. And that does not go to a court, does not go to the judiciary. What it does is essentially goes to USCIS, who then transfers it to the asylum office, where they have, whichever asylum office has jurisdiction over where you live. You then get notice of going to have an interview with the asylum officer, and I can tell you this takes time. If you come into the U.S. and apply for asylum in one of the bigger cities, which chances are that's what you're going to do, you might be waiting 2 to 4 years, for example, in L.A. Okay, and if you want to live in Montana or North Dakota, your wait's going to be a lot less. But then, you have to live in those places that have immense amounts of snow and freezing cold. And, perhaps from where you come from, you've never seen a snowflake. So, wherever you come in and wherever you live, that jurisdictionally is where you're going to apply for asylum. So, in regards to that, you wait the 2 to 4 years, give or take, for an interview. Then when you have the interview, the asylum officer will do one of two things. The asylum officer will grant it, at which point a year later you can get the green card, and the purpose of this video is null and void. Or the officer will specifically say they're not denying it, which in reality they are, but they'll say they're not denying it and that you can fight your case in front of the immigration court. And what they'll do is they will forward the case to the immigration court. You will be served with an NTA, or a notice to appear, and then you'll have to fight your case in immigration court, and that's going to take, give or take, 1 to 2 to 3 years, depending on the backlog of the immigration court. Now, once you fight it out in immigration court, and that's, is much more formal atmosphere, obviously, than when you're sitting across the desk from a asylum officer, but there's going to be a trial, submissions, witnesses, evidence, testimony, and so forth. So in this particular regard, if you lose at the immigration court, you then have 30 days to appeal to the Board of Immigration Appeals. And this is still an administrative body. It is still under the Department of Justice, and it is still not the judiciary. However, if it does get to the BIA and they overturn the judge, that's great. But if not, and when it gets to the BIA, you're looking at about 1 to 2 more years of appeal process at the BIA. And then, and that's assuming they don't summarily dismiss it. And that assumes that you filed it properly, because if you file it 31 days rather than 30 days, like you're supposed to, it's basically garbage and they'll return it. If you submit something that has no viable legal arguments, they'll summarily dismiss it without ever having a panel decide on the merits of it. So once it goes to the BIA, if you lose, then you have 30 days to do what's called a petition for review, and this goes to the Circuit Court of Appeals, which that is the judiciary, and that'll whatever circuit will depend upon jurisdictionally where you live. I mean, for example, if you live in Florida, that's the 11th Circuit. If you live in California, that's the 9th Circuit. If you live in Texas, that's the 5th Circuit, and so on. And so once it gets up to a petition for review, you're looking at about another year, give or take, for the justices to make a decision on that and or request oral argument. So in continuing with the theme of the day, if you lose at the Ninth Circuit, you can then do what's called a petition for rehearing en banc. And what that does is that goes directly up to the same circuit, but instead of only 3 justices hearing your matter, you'll have the whole panel. And obviously it's not easy to get a petition for rehearing granted, let alone to have them reverse what the original decision was, but that is certainly doable. Now, if you get the petition for rehearing denied, you then have the opportunity to do what's called a writ of certiorari to the U.S. Supreme Court. And obviously, that takes an immense amount of work, and the chances of them being the justices actually picking your case is very small. But that would be, once it gets to the U.S. Supreme Court, that will be the end of the line as far as the appeals go. But to get it to the Supreme Court many times takes 8 to 10 years or more of appeals and fighting, and all the while assuming you've done it right, staying in the U.S., with various motions to stay and so forth. And so that, in a nutshell, is the path that can be taken if you have to go all the way up to the Supreme Court from sitting there across the desk from an asylum officer. It's all doable. Okay, it's just a matter of properly fighting your case. So if you like the video, click like, subscribe, and then feel free to give me a call. I'll give you a consultation, let you know what can be done. More on the coming videos.